Hello and welcome to the 38th episode of Coffee and Cocktails. I'm your host, Dr. Ann Wand. This month we are starting our new series called Giving Voice to the Voiceless. And to kick off what I anticipate will be a very eventful group of discussions, I thought we'd start off with Anthropologist Pragati Gupta, who will be talking with us today about how the caste system is manifested through India's higher education system. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. An honor to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. As per usual, we'll start off by having you tell us what drink you were having for the show, followed by a little bit about yourself. Pragati, would you like to start?
I am having, since I don't drink, I'm having an iced latte with...
You do drink. You're drinking liquids. You're drinking liquids. Come on. There's more to life. Come on.
I'm having an iced latte. That's it.
Sounds delicious. Iced latte works for me. Little bit of a sidebar story. When I was living in Italy years ago, I was thinking in English and I just needed a coffee just to like keep going. So I'm at this cafe and the guy at the cafe behind the counter says, "What do you want?" And I say to him in Italian, "I'd like a latte." And he looks at me and he goes, "Latte." And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Just latte." And I'm like, yes, of course. I just want a latte. And he's like, "Do you want it hot or cold?" I'm like, why is this guy asking me all of these questions? I just want a latte. And I said, hot? Like, how else would you serve a latte? So I sit down, I start pulling out my papers, and the guy comes over to me with the tiniest little shot glass of milk, hot milk, and goes, "Here's your latte." And I go, "Oh, I'm such an idiot." And I literally just walked up and said, I'd like some hot milk. I realized, no, when you're in Italy, you have to say a caffè latte, a coffee with milk. And anyway, so every time I hear, "Oh, I'm just having a nice latte," I think of that hot little shot glass of milk that man gave me. Very confused Italian bartender gave me. So anyway, moving on.
I did not know about this. I've never been to Italy, or I have never heard, like, I don't know much about the European culture, but I have on Instagram, this particular thing is so popular. Like, people will make so many Instagram reels about latte and how not to ask for latte in Italy.
They've got very strict rules. One of the other rules that I reached a point where I thought, I'm foreign, so like, just leave me alone. They have a very strict rule about how you cannot order a coffee with milk after 12. I've heard some places not even after 11 in the morning. I'm like, time out. I don't like strictly black coffee. I like a little bit of milk. But if you, God forbid, order a cappuccino or some latte-based coffee after 12, there's this idea that it'll make your tummy sick. And I'm like, no, it's not how it works. But they'll give you the weirdest looks. And I thought, you know what? I'm foreign. Just let me have what I want. Let me have my hot shot glass of milk. Just leave me alone. Sometimes you just got to let it go. It's like chai tea, whereas chai just means chai, just means tea. Yeah. So you're going to have a tea. Yeah. Well, tell us before we get into the, ins and outs of the work you're doing, which is super interesting. And I would imagine a lot of the listeners may not be aware of what's going on. So I thought we'd just sort of dial back and start from the beginning, if that's okay with you, and then sort of work our way up. So if you could you tell us what initially got you interested in the topic that we're going to talk about today?
I think initially I began writing about caste from a familial perspective, kinship perspective, and gender perspective. So like in my household, since intercaste marriages are a very new phenomena, like at least in India, because caste is perpetuated a lot by marriage. So what really got me into was how one of my sister-in-laws, who's upper caste, has married into a family that is, compared to her status, pretty lower caste. But she has no idea of how our caste has manifested in, because a lot of my family's caste identity has been mystified over the years. So I grew up very ignorant about my own caste identity. I had no understanding of my caste identity solely because caste works not just in a vacuum. It works in conjunction with gender, class, just like any form of social stratification. But um, so what got me interested was when I started my undergrad degree, I started to think a lot more critically about my own position, because that was the first time my caste identity was questioned. And I was made to think, oh, where do I belong in this debate? And, where do I come from? And what should be my position? Am I upper caste? Am I lower caste? Oh, am I what? And like that sense of ignorance was forcefully taken away, when I started my higher education. So initially, I started thinking about my own caste identity. And, eventually, little by little, I started deriving these questions that later formulated into, questions, research questions. But my orientation and my interest in caste is very much personal, and very much of what I have observed and experienced outside of the fieldwork that I've done.
That's really interesting. I think you'd find, at least I know from my own personal experience, I think a lot of the research that we do, whether that you're a journalist, you're an anthropologist, sociologist, or just a person in general being interested in something, I think a lot of it really stems down to our own experiences, and then starting to see those experiences through a different lens, maybe because somebody's held a mirror to us or treated us in a different way. So I think that's really interesting. And I'd like to dive in a bit more about that if we could. So there's a lot of questions I'd like to ask, but based on the sort of stuff that you've sort of told me, can you give us an idea, especially for those who aren't familiar with the caste system in India, how it's based? Because I know some of the things, the material that you sent me, which will be available in the show notes on our website after we post this, is that caste isn't just based on maybe religious stratifications. One of the things you talked about, which I thought was really fascinating, is that it's actually quite multi-layered, and it's not binary in the sense of, oh, you're from your Brahmin community, therefore you are X. Could you tell us, how is caste negotiated, and how is it made sense of, and how is it stratified?
Basically, there are two. So in anthropology, like when we're first taught caste, we're first taught about the Varna system. So the Varna system is a fourfold system. It's at four broad categories. If you can imagine a pyramid, at the top of the pyramid would be the Brahmins, and then would come the Kshatriyas, then would come the Vaishyas, and then the Shudras, and then the Ati Shudras, the untouchables or the Harijans. So what happens is these broad categories are often misleading, because this is not where and how caste functions. Because amidst these categories are various subcategories, and because of the colonial effect and the way of taking census, there is the angle of status claim. Like, so there are castes who would say, I'm not Vaishya, I am Kshatriya, because, I practice so and so and so. Because a lot of caste is also based on purification and pollution. So and your occupation. That, Brahmins are supposed to be the ones who read the Vedas, or the ones who are educated and the ones who are intellectuals. And what happens then is, then the besides the twice born, others are the untouchables, or very many castes, the marginalized castes, it's a comparative understanding. So in comparison to which caste am I marginalized, and I am above which caste, is the basis of discrimination. So these are the there are few tenets. So it's your occupation, it's your it's your ability to practice purity and pollution in comparison to other castes. It's endogamy, in the sense you marry within your own subcaste, not even your own broader category of castes, but your subcaste. So, for example, my own caste status, I come from the broader category of what you would call Marwadi. Like, this is a group of castes that belong to the Rajasthan region of India. But amidst this particular broader category, there are various subcastes like Agarwal, Khandelwal, and then comes Mahavar, Jain. There are so many, subcastes, and a lot of this is very comparative. So compared to the Agarwals, we would be considered lower caste, but compared to the Mohors, we would be considered, compared to them, we are above them. So a lot of caste is practiced on the basis of comparative discrimination. So Mahavars would be discriminated against by the Agarwals and the Khandelwals, but the Mahavars will discriminate against the Mohors to maintain a sense of status in the society.
Okay. So how does caste compare to class then? If there's a Westerner listening, which I would imagine there'd be quite a few, how does it compare, I guess? So the example I keep thinking of, when I moved to the UK, one of the things I was quite aware of was this idea of class. And, when somebody would say, I'm middle class, in my head, it was very different than how it was portrayed. And I realized that middle class is actually, they're doing like quite well for themselves financially, or at least giving off the impression that they're doing quite well financially. So in terms of stratifications and that sort of thing, how would you define class as compared to caste, or are they one and the same?
I think that in India is very complex, because what happens is that class status, or like an elevation in the class status, does not do away with caste discrimination very necessarily. So even if you are, although, like, what happens is that if you come from a lower caste background, you've had late access to education, and you've had late access to a variety of occupations that became available to you very later on. But since you don't have access to education, you don't have access to that modern abstract language that comes along with education, right?
Okay, so like English, for example.
Yeah, for example, English. So like, personally, my grandmother is somebody who's not had, has not had formal education at all. She's never gone to school. She was married off at the age of 12 or 14, and she had her first child by the age of 15. So my grandmother has not received any formal education, but on the other hand, I have had friends whose grandmothers have had comparatively better education than my grandmother. So my grandmother did not have access to that because of both her class and caste status. And
yeah. So would you say, if we were to look at language as a marker of caste and class, why is English a marker of both of those items? And how does this affect marginalized communities, or communities that may be perceived by some caste systems as being marginalized?
So, I use a lot of Gopal Guru's work in my research, and Gopal Guru talks about this at a great length as to how English is English is a marker of a frightening code of conduct, because like a lot of lower caste people and people who come from marginalized castes are first generation learners, because their parents and communities were subject to occupations that were dehumanizing, and they were completely ostracized from the society.
Could you give some example of what those occupations would look like?
It would be a lot many times domestic helpers would come
Okay.
from lower caste backgrounds, and a lot of dehumanizing, cleaning work would be accorded to the so-called untouchable castes or lower caste backgrounds, and a lot of lower caste people would not have access to formal education. So even after independence, they would not be able to achieve or go for jobs, even though they have the freedom to, because now that we are a democracy and caste discrimination has been quote unquote abolished by the government, its residues still exist
Okay.
in the form of who has first access to anthropology? It was first the white man and then the Brahmin man who had access to the field in India, for especially when it comes to sociology and anthropology. If you would see, a lot of academia is dominated by the twice born or the upper caste.
So sorry, I know I'm asking a lot of questions, but what does it mean to be twice born?
It means your family owns a lot of land, and your family owns a lot of your family had first access to colonial education or first access to English education, which is now very important to do any sort of thing, because now we live in a globalized world and English is the language thereof. And even in schools, all our courses, like unlike other countries where they're taught in their native language, our courses are taught in English. Like, I have had 12 years of high school education in complete English, and even my undergraduate and graduate degrees were in English. So,
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, even though at home I spoke Hindi and Odia because I came from Odisha, but my education was mostly and completely in English. So again, access to English is not something everybody can have, because there are private schools and there are public schools. And at times, public schools do not have access to good English. And that is why they are like, a lot of students who come from marginalized backgrounds cannot go to the top universities.
Interesting, because they don't have that access to English, correct?
Yeah, okay. Because all the exams are held in English mostly.
Okay. So if we can kind of take that bit of background information, which is super crucial to understanding the work that you do. One of the things that, when we were talking about previously, is you said that higher education, and you mentioned this briefly just now, was normally reserved for the upper class, for the Brahmin community. Yes. And that there were attempts made by the government to allow more marginalized communities to have access to higher education, especially top tier higher educational facilities in India, of which, as you mentioned, all the courses were going to be taught in English. And for those from marginalized communities, English, they would be the first ones in their families, A, to have access to this higher education, and B, let alone that, you would also have access to it in English. In the process of the policies that were put in place by the government, which if you could give us a brief synopsis of that in a second, that would be great. One of the items that was developed by the government was what you referred to as the quote unquote reservation policy in higher education. If you could tell us a bit about what that means and the policies that were put in place, that would be very helpful. But also, if you could tell us how it relates to a sort of negative response by the Brahmin community in the form of what they called reverse discrimination. If you could tell us a bit about, the responses to that policy as well, that would be really helpful for us.
I think I work mostly with this perception of reverse discrimination. So basically what happens because I'm going to be very simplistic in this explanation. So what happens is that in India, we have a lot of entrance exams and cutoff policy. So when I completed my 12th grade exams, and I was about to enter colleges, I gave a a nationwide board exam, the result of which was used for my admission into Delhi University. Okay, so like if I scored a 95% and the college cutoff is 95%, I get in, especially for my course. So like it's course wise. So if I went for sociology honors, so the course cutoff was 95%, for example. So that is then divided into three categories: general, SC, like many categories: general, SC, ST, OBC, and then there's for persons with disabilities, and there's army quota.
And I think it might be helpful for us, because I think a lot of listeners aren't going to know about any of this. Yeah. If you could just take a couple of these acronyms and explain what they mean and why they're there, that would also be useful.
Yeah. So so marginalized castes, like people who belong to marginalized castes, are categorized by the government in three categories: the scheduled caste, the scheduled tribe, and the other backward classes. So what happens is you have to go and you have to go to a local, government, tehsildar is what we call it, and, claim your status and say that, I belong to so and so community and I am regarded as somebody who belongs to the scheduled caste. So scheduled castes are the castes that were completely dehumanized, the Dalits, and you have to go and claim your status and get the certificate, and so you get some relaxation on the entrance exam marks or the cutoffs that you have to go, like you need for entry into colleges like Delhi. Colleges in Delhi University, if I'm being clear. So scheduled castes are Dalits and the ones that are completely dehumanized and totally ostracized from the society. And scheduled tribes would be the indigenous people or the Adivasis, who were also discriminated against in India. And then there is the other backward classes. These are, again, castes that have been marginalized and have been deprived of access to resources. So these are the three categories that the government has classified the marginalized castes into.
Okay. That's super helpful. And within that, you said that they have different markers or benchmarkers that they have to create. And it's so that they have this reservation policy, if I'm to understand it correctly, sort of gives a little bit more wiggle room in a roundabout sort of way for those who come from marginalized classes to have access to high-ranking universities. Is that correct? Or just any higher educational facility?
It is available for every higher education, not just like every higher education institution. You can claim your reservation and get some relaxation with the entrance percentage, like the cutoff or the entrance examination scores.
And I think you use a really interesting word, this term relaxation, right? I use the term wiggle room, but either way, there is a bit of a cushion, right?
Yeah.
And within that, it seems like some members, I don't want to assume everybody, but some members of the Brahmin community feel that there is an aspect of reverse discrimination / discrimination against themselves because they feel like those of other classes are getting in far more easily than they are. Is that correct?
Yeah, and they use the specific term called merit. Like they would use.
Tell us about that. I think that's really interesting. This twisting of words. Yeah.
Yeah. So like when I was reading up and I was doing my literature review for my master's dissertation,
which is excellently written, by the way, very, very well written. Anyway, continue.
I was reading the work of Satish Deshpande. So he talks about this joke. So like he talks about when in the nine, like I think when the second Mandal Commission was set up in India, and reservations were accorded to the other backward classes, that the government had classified a new category for the other backward classes. There was this joke where a a bunch of it was a very popular joke then. He talks about how if we are to send people into space in India, we would classify with like two SCs, two STs, and two OBCs or something like that. And there would be just one astronaut. Okay, so and this was this popularized joke during that point in time. And Satish Deshpande talks about the verbatim of this joke as to like how the the caste status of the so-called astronaut in this joke is clearly unclear, in the sense people would say that they are being discriminated upon while they're trying to say that caste does not exist by highlighting somebody else, the marginalized caste status, and trying to mystify their own. So he says that if you're reading this joke or you're hearing this joke, you know that the astronaut in question here is an upper caste person. And uh, and this is such a nuanced understanding of how the popular perception works, in the sense what happened with the creation of these categories was that although reservation is the right policy and it should be there, because um, caste-based discrimination manifests materially. It must manifests in a lack of access to resources and lack of access to education and social mobility in general. But the fact of how these how upper castes in the country have used this particular this particular categorization to their benefit by perpetuating this sense of castelessness amongst themselves and a sense of hyper visibilization of the caste of who they discriminate against, to say that, oh, you should not get reservations because it should be based on pure talent. But if you don't have access to education, how for hundreds and thousands of years, how would you ever know if you're talented or not? And talent is a very socio-political term, and it does not, manufacture itself in vacuum. If your definition of talent is a room full of white men or a room full of upper caste men, then that particular talent or the merit that you're talking about is not operating in a vacuum from the society.
So I guess from what the takeaway is that talent is subjective, right? And it can be contingent on the way you look, the environment that you come from. So to say, well, you need to have talent, the impression I'm getting from what you're telling me is, well, how do you quantify that? And what does that look like, right? If we could kind of, now that we've got sort of an idea of this reservation policy and this idea of reverse discrimination that the Brahmin community or some members feel is happening, could you tell us, as somebody from a marginalized community, having gone through higher education, when did you become aware that people from certain castes were being treated differently in the classroom?
My first encounter with caste was like when so I was talking to my mother, and I was like, very ignorantly so, I was like, oh, I wish I could also, take the benefit of, being, what if I could also get these relaxations? She's like, you can, because we come from the OBC community, but you don't realize what you will have to go through if you go get that certificate and you go write that you're not from the general category and you're from the OBC category. When you go to Delhi University, you'll know how you are going to be treated.
Yeah, and OBC being other backwards community, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the labels. Yeah.
So we are like, I wouldn't call myself the most marginalized caste, but yeah, comparatively in our local hierarchy, we are considered lower caste, comparatively lower caste. Although we have a few castes beneath our particular subcaste. So my mom was like, you're not to discuss your caste status when you go to Delhi with anybody, because I was born and raised in Odisha, and my family has North Indian origins. So nobody in Odisha really understands, and our caste is a little mystified back at home. But my mom is from Delhi. She's North Indian by birth. So she's like, you are not to discuss your caste status with anybody, or you're not going to discuss your caste with anybody. And I was like, why? She's like, you can't. You're going to be discriminated against if you do. And she was right.
Really?
I had friends in my living space. I lived in a PG, or like a paying guest situation, where it was like a hostel sort of situation, but it was a private hostel, not the college. It was not affiliated with the college. So I had a few friends who went to the same college as I did, and they had so much casteism instilled in them. And they would be like, I'm not going to marry a guy who's not a Brahmin. That's going to make my bloodline impure. And
I was going to say, it's got some Harry Potter Voldemort vibes going on there. Anyway, go on.
It's so scary when you're in that position that you realize that if your friends get to know your caste status or where you come from, they're not gonna they're not gonna treat you the same way anymore. And they were like, it's gonna make my bloodline impure. And when I went to the classroom, all my professors would talk about reservations. Okay. And I had a classmate who just stood up and said, I don't know why they have, why do they have this reservation policy? People who don't even deserve to be in colleges get in. And she made these so many blatant and, like, rather, I would say, not physically, but violent in I don't know how it felt. The way she spoke about reservations felt like she was trying to violate somebody. And I'm not even gonna
say what they said necessarily.
Yeah, I mean,
that's fair.
Yeah, she stood up and she was like, I have so-and-so friend and she's from so-and-so community, but she went to the same school as I did. Why is she getting reservations? And I'm like, the fact that you still know her caste and you're highlighting her caste in this particular classroom is why she deserves to get that kind of reservations, because it's to make up for a damage that can never be made up for.
So was this particular person upset that they felt like their friend who came from a marginalized community wasn't given the same opportunities as other people?
No, she was mad that she was given the same opportunity. She was getting reservations, that like her friend could get into a better college than her because she was availing the reservation policy. And
sounds like her friend needs to find new friends.
Yeah. and my mom was like, I told you that if you availed your reservations, you would have to constantly hide. It's like So on paper, I belong to the general category. So like the upper castes have been manifested into the general, while the others are considered, quote unquote, their identities are highlighted. So the upper castes, with all their benefits, early access and resources, and economic and social capital, um, get to hide behind the general category, while somebody who belongs to the marginalized caste has to go and get a certificate and has to highlight their caste identity and then get discriminated against, with even if they make to these elite institutions.
It sounds almost like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, you know? And if you do get this reservation, that you just have to sort of hide it away in your pocket and just be glad that you have it, and then just don't say anything and just keep working.
So Gaurav Patania talks about this particular damned if you do and damned if you don't. When he conducted interviews with students in higher education institutions. I think he conducted about 200 interviews, and there were students who used to hide when they were going to pay the fees, because upper caste students were going to be mad if they saw if that they're getting some off on their fees, or like some sort of relaxation on the college fee. And upper caste students would be like, low caste students have low graduation rates because they're dumb.
Ooh, wow.
And we graduate better because we have higher graduation rates because we are smart. So we need to abolish reservations, because, and these are the words they use, like, and
that's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah, and this is so much mental distress that is caused because of it.
Which sort of like leads us into this other element that you'd mentioned, because you talk about the effects on mental health, and it can be, I mean, I can only imagine the sort of stress. You finally have this opportunity to go to this amazing school, and now you have to hide your identity. You have to hide where your family comes from. You can't even be prideful of where your family comes from, because what if your air quote friends find out? So how does caste-based discrimination, inequality, we've already talked about how it's made evident in the classroom, but how does it affect students on a more personal level, especially with regards to their mental health?
So when I was talking to one of my interlocutors, who was a professor in a very esteemed public, institution, and we were talking, and they tell me that, whenever the question of reservations come like, are insinuated in my class, and I do so very intentionally to get to know my students and their viewpoints. And so like many students will stand up and they'll say they'll be totally anti-reservationist in their approach, and they would make these violent damnations, and stand up and give their opinion very vehemently, and be very stubborn about how reservations are not useful or whatever. And there would be a bunch of students who come from these so-called reserved categories, and they would literally have tears in their eyes, and they would not speak up, no matter how bright they are, and no matter how how smart they are. And I have witnessed this firsthand, because like when the girl in my classroom spoke up, nobody countered her. Everybody else was silent. So was I. And and you were like, and when I got to know somebody who was like ignorant about her own caste for most of her early life, and I got to know that in one sense, I was also silent, and I was sitting, and I had these thoughts in my mind, but I would not speak up. And I would not talk about how caste manifests or why reservations are necessary. I just sat through it.
Mm,
And keeping that silence can be very distressing.
mm,
And,
mm,
and and at times, so what really also struck me was that the professors, most of our professors, especially in social sciences, are upper caste themselves. And for them to insinuate these questions in the classroom in order to educate the upper caste students at the cost of the distress that is caused to the ones that come from marginalized communities also at some point does feel unfair
mm, mm.
and in need of serious sensitization.
Well, it also seems quite self-perpetuating,
Yeah.
and how do you navigate a system where you have professors who are coming to the table with their own misconceived perceptions, and then you have a certain percentage of the students that are also casteist, as you put it. um how it's almost like how can a reservation policy be beneficial if they're coming into an environment where they are still constantly reminded of the fact that they're not welcome?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't necessarily expect there to be an answer to this final question, but I think it's something that is worth having at least a discussion about. Do you think discrimination in the higher educational classroom and sector in India can be overcome, if at all? And if yes, how?
I think, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's something, I cannot have an answer to the overcoming part, but I do feel like we can have a system or like education where people are more sensitized about their own caste, and like especially in academia,
Mm,
because in academia and in the mental health pedagogy where um, in the Indian psychological therapeutic setting, which I was a part of too, and I still am. I go to therapy, and I've been in therapy for a long time. I was in therapy for a year, then I had discontinued, and I'm in therapy again. And a lot many times, your social identity and what causes certain anxieties is not understood because there is no language to understand this caste based discrimination. So, like, I
mm,
talk about this very awkward relationship that therapists have with, social identity. Like, when I asked them, have you ever dealt with somebody who told you that, you know, they had very hostile comments coming onto them within the classroom because of reservations, and uh, none of them had an answer to how to combat that situation.
mm,
And and that means that the psychiatric or the psychological research does not take into account caste based discrimination as a source of distress.
mm,
And that is the problem that I highlight. So at one stage that there is caste system perpetuating itself through the experiential within the classroom and the everyday life, and then there
mm.
is um, no recourse to deal with that distress.
Do you think it's almost just become accepted and that's why?
I think it is this lack of it is India's obsession with objectivity. At times the theoretical and the public and the private is too separated in the Indian mindset. So if I were to tell my friends or try to talk to my school friends about what I research with, and and tell them, in real life you're upper caste, and my research has real life repercussions, and there are some standards and ethics that and values that I hold, and those are non-negotiables for me. So if I tell them that you're being casteist, they'll be like, why are you being so theoretical with me? Why are you trying to bring politics into our friendship? Not
Mm,
realizing that you know our friendship itself is political, and like everything we go through is political, and politics and your views on how marginalized communities are to be treated are the basis of your values and ethos. And if we can't really position ourselves in our research, or like I feel like Indian academia is very offended by reflexivity.
Interesting. Okay.
They're very offended by positionality. So I had this interview where I was asked, not just an interview, there were many times when even during my undergrad, I had friends in the same classroom question autoethnography. They were like, is autoethnography a valid method of research? And the same happened in this recent interview. I was asked, don't you think that you're going to get biased by your own position?
But our own position isn't everything that we do. That's
exactly.
The crux.
So for me to theorize it and be radical about where I come from and how I see things, and be open to criticism based on my own positionality, is something that Indian academia vehemently rejects at times. So a lot of research that I do does not really sit well with academics in India.
Would you say that the response has been different in the UK?
I would say the response has been different in the UK because many Dalit scholars, lower caste scholars, they end up coming to sensitize, they end up, because they don't get fundings or the support they need there for the research. So they go and, they come out. So like, I think in that sense, Western academia is more sensitive to the caste question because of the people who have to resort to coming to
the UK because they're not accepted in their home country.
Yeah. So like a lot of the research that Gaurav Patania does, and my supervisor, and a lot of their research, a lot of caste research is being done outside of India, and where people from India have institutional affiliations outside to do these projects.
And I think that is a really good way to sort of pause it, because you are going to be giving a bonus talk, which will be available on our Patreon for our Patreon followers. And you are going to be talking about how casteism is basically evident amongst the diaspora in the UK. Is that correct? So I'm really, really looking forward to that. So I'm going to take a little pause and say that's it from us at the moment at Coffee and Cocktails with your host, Dr. Ann Wand. Pragati, thank you so much for just giving us sort of like a little taster of what to expect. This bonus episode, I know, is just going to be a kicker. If you'd like more information on today's topic, it will be available on our website in the show notes. And if you'd like to check out Pragati's bonus talk, or she'll be talking about how caste system is evident in the UK and how it manifests itself, and she's going to be taking this talk just that extra step forward, then consider becoming a patron starting at £1 per month. It's support from our patrons that really helps to keep the show going. By becoming a patron, you get access to extra bonus content, patron-only interviews, panels, workshops, and much more. To join, just head over to patreon.com/Coffee and Cocktails podcast. Otherwise, that's it for now. Thanks for listening and have a great week.